To the curious, the seekers, and to the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych Podcast. Recently, the news has been filled with Google whistleblowers such as Zach Voorhees, and Americans are wondering how secure their communications are, how free their equal access to social media is, and whether certain ideas are actually being stifled. This has long been an organized effort among various people, some involved with the U.S. government, to direct, and I'm using a polite term, American thought and craft public opinion. One person who we've discovered has participated in that is Regina Dugan. With me today to consider Regina and a bit of the role that she's played in the U.S. as far as social media are Ken. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Cindy.
And Don. Hi, Don.
Hello, Cindy and Ken.
We want to begin with a little bit of insight into her background, and I think Ken is going to provide that for us.
Sure. Regina Dugan was born in 1963, is currently 56 years old, and obtained a bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering at VA Tech, Virginia Tech, and then had a short stint at NASA. Went back to Caltech for a PhD in mechanical engineering, and then in 1996 became a program manager at DARPA, specializing in landmine detection. And in the wake of both the Iraq deployment and then the Afghanistan later, after the attacks on the Trade Center, that became a hot field. But she did the year 2000, went into the private sector, and in kind of an unrelated area, securities and private investment, perhaps venture capital relating to defense industry projects. And then went back to DARPA in 2009 as director of DARPA, and that appears to have coincided with the Obama administration's first term election, and likely was in that group of people that were on the intel side. And some of our other familiar faces that we've covered, such as Jonathan Morgan, were younger versions of that same circle. And as DARPA director, DARPA achieved a kind of a unique distinction at that time. They had never been forwardly deployed, but they did deploy an actual DARPA forward cell in Afghanistan, and Regina visited there 5 times. In 2012, and appearing again to coincide with President Obama's second term of election, left DARPA to go to Google's ATAP, which stands for Advanced Technical and Projects, and was with the Motorola Mobility Division, and we'll get into the cell phone project ARA later in more detail, and also worked on biometrics and security projects relating to Google. And then in the year 2013, I think, there was a stint at Facebook, and that's the last we've heard of her. Her work at Facebook involved a project called Building 8, which was sort of modeled after the original Lockheed Skunk Works concept. And they worked on special projects, and some of them kind of esoteric, an interface program where you could actually type with your thoughts. I'm assuming that was a one-way street, but hey, you never know. But tapping the mind like that is kind of interesting and maybe even a little scary. And then the other part of that project was an ability to hear through skin vibrations. And for reasons unknown, and we'll speculate on that later, she left Facebook and has not been heard from since. At least on the public level, I'm sure she's doing just fine, but we just don't know exactly what she's doing at this point.
Well, yeah, there are some interesting sound bites of her and more than that, speeches on YouTube that you can hear her. And that's what we've done to kind of educate ourselves about this interesting person, is to listen to her, watch her speak, and how she communicates. And that's available on YouTube.
Do we want to talk a little bit about DARPA, just in case some of our listeners might not know what we're referring to when we refer to DARPA?
DARPA stands for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and it was started in the late 50s under a slightly different name, and basically has worked generally very constructively on projects relating to defense technology and the need to, in any military context, be dominant in various fields where strategic advantage could be had. And we, of course, look at DARPA as a sort of a secretive cell, but it's by necessity designed that way, naturally in the need for security and intelligence and keeping our adversaries one step at least behind the advancements. As I mentioned during the bio, the difference here, though, is that DARPA became a forward cell in a theater of war in Afghanistan, and that it was, I believe, it was in mine detection, and has spun off many people into private industry that will turn up in various contexts in our shows, and have already, in the field of let's call it social media management of or at times we could call that censorship. So that's a little bit troubling, is when the border between a military asset begins to become useful in a domestic theater such as cyberspace. So we'll be tackling that issue a little bit. But I guess we could just start with the earlier phase of Regina's career and look a little bit at, if we have the visual there, her involvement with RedX Defense did achieve a little bit of notoriety at one point, but it was ruled to be rather benign. It's quite common to have this sort of symbiosis between private industry and the military, and many times the best developments do occur in private industry and are then either sold to or sole sourced back to the military in a generally constructive manner. But I'll pause there and just see what feedback there is on how we view that difference. Where do we draw the line between civilian and military in this issue of censorship?
Well, yeah, backing up before we get to the censorship aspect of it, I think we really do have to recognize that in the modern world, warfare is not just guns and bullets on a battlefield, that it really does have to do with hearts and minds of the enemy and control of information systems. And if you control information systems, you can win the hearts and minds of the people that you hope to have control over. And throughout history, of course, the population that is waging war needs to be behind the war in order for that country to be successful in any military engagement. And so I think it's actually not surprising that an agency like DARPA would be involved in beginning to manipulate public opinion. America transitioned from being a draft-based military in the Vietnam era to being a enlisting without a draft, and subsequently. So for that transition to happen, you're going to have a population that buys into the war, so that, well, whatever war is going on, so that the people will enlist in the war and a draft won't be necessary, and all the resistance that entails. So it seems to me that actually behind the scenes, DARPA has probably been key in helping, if you want to put that in quotes, America transition into this let's say, more war-friendly society. And maybe you can tell I'm not entirely thrilled about that, but I think we have to face the fact that that's what's going on here. We have people that are finding ways to make America less resistant to whatever foreign engagements that the military wants to engage in overseas for whatever reason.
In Obama's last few months, and I can't remember if it was an executive order or a bill that he signed into law. It was made legal officially to propagandize the American people. I still see a constitutional requirement of separation, that the military not be the ones to do that, even though that was made legal, which I personally would prefer if it had not been made legal. But who is exactly doing that? There's probably a very fuzzy line between a lot of these government organizations that are doing that. So there's probably quite a bit of bleed over that crosses, in my mind, a constitutional line.
Well, I think it's very clear that, and we want to make sure we point out that DARPA is actually the agency that invented the internet. It wasn't Al Gore. It was the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, that was begun under a slightly different name by President Eisenhower, and that did end up inventing the infrastructure that became the internet. So that went from being a military operation to being a public operation. So really, DARPA underlies all of this control mechanism that we believe is inherently less controlled than it probably was ever intended to be. So what I'm saying is, we're naive if we don't suspect that there is some deeply embedded control mechanisms within the internet itself due to DARPA.
I think the most interesting case study on this was the first Iraq war, and the disinformation campaign was used to propagate the military theory that we would go straight through a frontal assault through the Kuwaiti oil fields and straight into Saddam's defense structure right there at the border. And that was hyped by the media. They were exaggerating the casualty rate, that we'd have 30,000 casualties, and it was quite traumatic to hear that. I remember, that being propagated, and then the brilliance of that whole thing. And aside from the fact that whether we agree the war was the right thing to do, but just taking this as a case study, is the end run around the back. Then that disinformation, domestic disinformation, was of course picked up by their side as well. And what we actually ended up doing was moving all the way around the their right flank, so saving countless lives, American service people's lives, and so on, and essentially overrunning the defenses by outflanking way around the outside. So the point is that but they did reveal that later, a few weeks after the war, say, well, we had to do this. We had to have this public disinformation campaign. So it was sort of an open book. And it's, even to this day, it's sort of a textbook example of disinformation. But the problem that we'll face, and we'll discuss today, is that is that same strategic expertise being used to unseat a duly elected president? And as we peel back the layers of what happened with the what we now call the Russia hoax, it's almost generally regarded as being, at least from the political end, a complete hoax. And we have foreign assets being used in the form of the Steele dossier, and we've already reviewed in another podcast how the German Marshall Fund EU bloc was involved, and then we've got Ukraine popping up as disinformation agents. And this is a problem. I mean, when they're using this expertise, when the DARPA people go off into private industry and carry out filtering operations, and they employ machine learning to essentially target the American civilian population. That's where I think we have to draw the line. And we'll be looking at that today. I think Regina came in really early on the scale of threat. And at that time, when she came in, it was more of a hacker. They would refer. I've listened to a couple of her earlier broadcasts, or they're now on YouTube, but her speeches and so on would refer to the danger from hackers, which was very real. And then they would point to the Stuxnet operation, where we actually used a virus to disable I think they were the centrifuges in Iran. And what we would generally definitely regard as a constructive operation. So that was the original plausibility for DARPA moving into cyberspace as defending against hackers and carrying out offensive operations. And we'll open this up too for discussion, but at what point did it sort of turned a corner at some point? And I think it happened with the advent of the 2015 election, and looking at where was Regina then? She had her DARPA, was doing her time over at DARPA, and then was at Google. She went to Google in 2012. And with the advent of this new, emphasis, I'm just wondering if she became disillusioned at some point during this time period, having lived through the phase and seeing how somebody in their late 50s would have lived through the phase when it was constructive. And then, we're starting to realize it probably was not constructive. I think that slowly that dawn is arriving, where we're realizing, looking back on this ridiculous Russia concoction to justify the use of military assets in a civilian conversational context.
Well, there's a big difference in my mind between using this kind of technology defensively, which in this speech from 2012, she was talking about defending from hackers and various types of cyber attacks. I think it becomes an entirely different ball game when you move from defending, I should say war, not ball game. When you move from a defensive position, that being protecting against hackers, to an offensive position wherein you are employing the technology to determine outcomes, to decide in advance what you want to happen, which direction you want society to move, and then deploying your technology in order to do that. That's no longer a defensive position. That's more of an offensive position. And I'm wondering, and I would kind of hope for her own sake, that she may have become aware of that, as some of the Google whistleblowers who have been coming forward lately have become aware that this technology is being used offensively against the American people, and maybe that had an impact on her.
Okay, so Cindy, based on what you were just saying about the possibility of Regina working out her moral issues, what do you think about the example that Ken gave us about Stuxnet? If you were her, or just how would you think that handling that kind of a situation would be wise? Because this is a foreign country. You're going into a foreign country and you're using something is that being offensive, sending a virus into their Iranian centrifuges, or is that being defensive with regard to your technical capability?
Considering posse comitatus, I would say that would probably, it's not unconstitutional to do that. Now, I would say that I might not feel like it's ethical. I might not want to do something like that. But strictly in terms of, is it constitutional or not, which is what I think some of when it's used against the American people, that line is crossed. And people may think that they have good intentions. They may, and they may truly have good intentions, but as we know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And at some point, some of these people, there's a line that they don't want to cross. And with Zach Voorhees, what he mentioned was when Google removed kofefe from their translation dictionary. That's what when he said he realized he could no longer be in support of the kind of work that they were doing, using the technology to alter opinion, because they removed that word so that the president would look like a fool in his tweet in which he mentioned kofefe, and that started a big uproar. So that to me is the constitutional line. Again, personally, I would not like to participate in using that technology against people in other countries, simply because it's not clean, it's not honest, it's more kind of stabbing somebody in the back. And interestingly enough, they say that when a woman commits murder, she's more likely to use poison. And this is kind of a womanly approach, I think, to warfare, is to to kind of sneak up behind somebody and to poison their informational streams.
Kind of like Tokyo Rose.
Since the military cannot afford to pay enough to recruit qualified software and internet engineers for this sort of work, it has turned to commercial firms. There are already some out there, companies that are technically network security operations, but will also carry out offensive missions, often of questionable legality. But that has always been an aspect of the corporate security business. Some of these firms have quietly withdrawn from the internet security business, gone dark, and apparently turned their efforts to the more lucrative task of creating cyber war weapons for the Pentagon. It may have been one of these firms that created or helped create the Stuxnet worm, unquote. So it's kind of an ambiguous statement, but it does get into that sort of that gray area. And, I see some fallacies in this statement, though. And the first, when we look at the linguistic, or at least the influencing part of this, the very first 5 words are usually where the Trojan horse meaning is hidden. And it starts in this context: since the military cannot afford to pay enough to recruit. Okay, I take a time out on that one, because the U.S. government can afford anything. If the threat level is high enough, the money is there. So this thing of framing this whole thing on Uncle Sam with his pockets hanging out is just, nonsensical. But everybody's going to miss that, because she'll usually, when they make statements like this, they'll bury this right in the beginning of the sentence to kind of frame the meaning, anchor it.
Yeah, I agree. It's not like really they're going before Congress asking for this money. They haven't done that in a long time.
So the overall overriding theme as we move into this, what I'm going to call the techno-fascist regime hiding behind the deep state. We do have a deep state, but I think the definition is going to be broadened as we move into, especially as we unravel the doings of this Russia hoax, and we see it as a worldwide effort that actually transcends legality, and it transcends state. It's almost this elitist group of people that have taken it upon themselves, without sanction from a governing agency or a chief executive or even Congress, and have just sort of split off and created their own money in the form of the Facebook Libra, or have just carried out censorship unmoored by any restraints from government. And we see that with Google with their censorship. Facebook, they're all doing the same thing, but it starts, the step in that direction started, and it was not noticed. And I think this is what we're getting on today, is that Regina was right there, and I don't think it's her fault. I think we moved with baby steps into this regime where we are now by sort of overlooking some of the fundamentals of this slow walk to really transcend government completely, where these agencies have almost completely gone rogue in some cases, especially as we see what's going on with the Trump case.
Yeah, since we're getting into the psychology of this, I want to explain my view is that the ultimate deep state program is actually within people's minds, and in which they either agree or disagree that they are going to give their autonomy over to another person or another group, or they cooperate with that kind of a disempowering of the individual. And we might want to look at agencies or companies like Facebook, Google, DARPA as being the totalitarian, but ultimately each of us as an individual is what either empowers or disempowers those entities. And usually people that empower them believe that they're empowering them for good. So that means we have to look at what's really going on. Are we empowering something that started out good and may have left the path of good? And that's the kind of thing we're going to try to look into using the tool of psychology as we get into that. And that's our purpose here. I'm hopeful that Ken will broach the subject with the MBTI, as that's usually the best lead-in into that area, and then we can get into the Enneagram on Regina.
Do we want to play this clip of Regina so people kind of have a context for the person that we're talking about?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's
but
really good.
Technologists are a particularly optimistic group. Here's why. Most of the nerds I know, and I know a lot of nerds, believe this, that the future is not a story of inevitability with us as passive participants in its unfolding. The future is a story that is actively written with us as engineers and architects in its building. Technological advances have fundamentally changed the world. Often this requires that we believe in a new future and then set our sights on building it. Sometimes that requires we believe in seemingly impossible things. And let me give you a few examples. So in 1895, Lord Kelvin declared that heavier than air flying machines were impossible.
So here we see just briefly the premise for really what she's describing as social engineering. And I guess at that time, this was done, recording, I think, in 2013. So one of my pet theories about why she went to Google is she saw the Clinton administration coming down the road and probably would have been called in for cabinet level position of some sort or another, who knows what. But she had a pretty good resume going already. And here she is giving this speech. So they thought everything was just going great. We had Obama's in the White House, and we'll have Hillary coming right behind, and everything will be great.
Everything is awesome.
Yeah, what I see here in Regina is the optimism of somebody that is coming from what you could call sociologically throughout history the priest class. This is the intelligentsia mindset that is preparing a way for the future that she really believes is something good, and she's not going to willingly ally herself with something that is negative. So she's selling the future, but she understands it in her own unique way. So that's what we're seeking to do here, is understand, okay, what's really going on under the hood. She believes that it's good, but how is her brain operating, and how is it framing things as good or bad? And we might see that she's allying herself with the Clinton Global Initiative and think, well, she must be bad. Well, probably not. She probably believes that there's something good going on here that she wants to be a part of or to influence.
Yeah, I think she was sort of, she was starting to be, my feeling on this is she's starting to be used as sort of a PR asset, and probably wasn't on the personal level in that inner circle, but was sort of like the iconic and very talented, female nerd. And it's actually rare in the MBTI world. Computers just don't interest many types of personalities, and her type I'll just venture a guess, is definitely intuitive, introverted, intuitive, and thinker, an NT, which is a very rare type in women. But they needed her, and I still think there's a need for this to be advanced in the culture too, is to try to draw in talent from every place it hides if it's being held behind. But so she was there definitely to promote that aspect, and probably would have achieved much more notoriety had Hillary been elected.
Yeah, and she is an interesting person as far as how she displays her intelligence. And I agree with you that she is a T in terms of the MBTI. Looking at her from the Enneagram standpoint, I believe that she is a 4 with a 5 wing, and possibly a 5 with a 4 wing. And of course, the 4 is a part of the emotional triad, but how close they are to 5 determines, how that plays out. And with a 3, they don't come off as being emotional either. So sometimes the only typical emotional type of the 3 Enneagram emotional triad types would be the 2 that are less openly head-oriented, and whereas Regina is coming from that standpoint of being a nerdy head type person. And because one of the interesting things about Enneagram 4s is that they are very much different from each other by their subtype. There's also the wings, but also the subtypes that influence the individual's approach to life. And the 3 subtypes being either self-preservation or social subtype, or the one-on-one or sexual subtype. And they're very different in the 4s. And so I did a little bit of reading, and I found within the Complete Enneagram by Beatrice Chestnut, I boned up on the different subtypes of the 4. And I came to think that she's probably a self-preservation 4. And it doesn't really mean what you think it would mean, the self-pres type. They're actually, you would think that the social subtype would be more oriented toward the group, but actually not. I think sometimes in the past, the self-pres 4s have been called reckless or dauntless, or they tend to really believe strongly in something that they want to do. And I think I have a little insight into this subtype because I believe my mother was probably the same subtype. If you tell them that they shouldn't do something, that's probably the strongest motivator to get them to do it. They'll do something just because it's going to be an extreme challenge. And if you see somebody like Regina, who is an expert in the field that is on the cutting edge of technology, that to me seems like a self-pres 4 subtype script. So there's a lot of information there on the screen. I'm not going to read it all or even any of it, but I wanted to give people that reference so that people could look it up and study it on their own. And there are some interesting highlights here. I think she is a very interesting type. That with regard to our whole conversation, and I'm not going to be hard and fast that I'm sure that she's this subtype. It's just the one that seems the most likely to me based on how I see her life script and her presentation of herself playing out. This is somebody who is a believer, but also will, in whatever area they dedicate themselves, but they will also be open to recognizing opposition within that same new territory. And that's kind of what Ken was just describing, that she might have run across within her contacts within Facebook or within whatever DARPA organizations that she was continued to be a part of, that they recognize adversaries because the adversaries are going to be taking this new area in a direction they don't want to go. For instance, if someone was in a field of psychiatry they would either be pro-medication or anti-medication, and then you would have that dichotomy there. Well, I think with Regina, that she's probably has some dividing lines within her whole vision of the future, that she needed to take a stand internally and say, no, I'm not going to go down that road. And so she's not exactly a whistleblower, because she probably believes that she's somebody that wants to work within the system to bring about change. Especially the self-preservation subtype is going to be very oriented towards enduring through whatever trials that are necessary to achieve the end that she wants to achieve. So she's not going to bail because she has opposition, but she's going to recognize the opposition and deal with it whatever way makes sense to her. And that's kind of how I see her in the Enneagram. A very interesting person.
Cindy, if we could cue up that other speech, there's one that we have collected. It's actually kind of hard to find, and Regina does this address during her transition, right about the time when she moved from DARPA to Google. And one of the reasons we're pursuing this in so much depth is that she is, at least in this modern era with the censorship happening and everything, a very historical figure to move from the federal agency over to the largest information agency serving the civilian population. And we won't be playing it today probably, but there's a very iconic TED Talk called Love and Work that people can go see. You maybe have already seen it. It has a lot of views. And I do, just interjecting, I sense that she is sincere in her communication, and especially Cindy's got the picture on the screen now, but we'll move, if we could, Cindy, to the address. And just the beginning, if we can play the beginning and the end. I thought it was really kind of profound how she summarizes. It's almost like a bookend. Her speeches were very well organized, and all her public appearances were extremely clear and insightful as far as her topic.
It is the makings of novels and poetry, from Dickens to Gibran, that the best and the worst occupy the same time, that wisdom and foolishness appear in the same age, light and darkness in the same season, that joy is sorrow unmasked, that humans are suspended like scales between inseparable, contrasting emotions, only at standstill and balanced when they feel nothing. These are the timeless words of our existence. We know it is true of everything. Cyberspace is occupied by humans. As of March 31st of this year, it is occupied by just over 2 billion, or about 30% of the world's population. It should come as no surprise then that it is occupied by some of the best and some of the worst, by both wisdom and foolishness, acts of aggression and peaceful protests, by those who have found a new way to have their voice heard, and those intent on suppressing voices that do not echo their own, by a new class of talent, so-called hackers. They are good and bad, expert and novice, by pacifists and warriors, attackers and defenders, by profound heroism and shocking injustice. It is a new domain, but it conforms to the timelessness of our existence. We know it is true of cyberspace too. The advent of the internet more than 40 years ago created both tremendous opportunity and new risks. Today, there are 800 million friends on Facebook and the emergence of cyberbullying. On a slow day, there are 140 million tweets sent by microbloggers, from mundane musings to hashtagged revolutions.
So with that, it's very philosophical speech, drawing on many archetypal images and really delivered quite well. I'm going to go with the introverted intuitive being the dominant function, or at least the secondary function. So that would rule in only 2 personality profiles in the MBTI, and they would be in order of probability. I'm going to say ENTJ, but with a really close second choice of INTJ, both having the advantage of giving me the introverted intuition answer that I'm looking for. In the Jungian conception, she would be the introverted intuitive type, and there were only 8 types in the original theories of personality, Carl Jung, in the early 1900s. So I see a deep connection to eternal values, and although they are somewhat how shall we say this, not really theologically grounded, but just sort of grounded in timeless, whatever her version of timeless reality is. And it does seem like it's almost scrubbed clean of any attachments to religious archetypal imagery, yet she sort of evolves her own, it's almost like her own self-created religious vision in that framework that of the work that she does. So she's sort of finding that expression through that filter. So I don't know if that sheds light on the other things, but she does seem to have this sort of solid undercurrent of moral conviction that may have been sacrificed at various times. Anyone in the military needs to follow orders, and I'm sure that she's had to adapt to that world. But after crossing over the boundary back into private industry again, I think she realized more autonomy, and we'll move into the Project ARA phase, which does become somewhat troublesome. Let's look back at the time period. This is, she spills the date as being March 31st, 2012 during this presentation. And I had been starting a business at about that time. So I remember very well the development in smartphones. They were sort of in their infancy in 2009. They were kind of wonky, but they really started to hit the ground running in about that time period. And the change in her career occurred when she left DARPA to join Google, and she joined the Motorola unit there. And I'm not as familiar with the corporate doings as far as whether it was a wholly owned subsidiary or whatever, but these projects sort of move through different classifications of entity, and they get traded around and closed and opened, and ownership changes, but the core group normally stays there.
Ken, didn't you write us in email that it was right around that time that Congress legalized cyber war? I have these articles. It was, let's see, the date was December 18th, 2011. Leadership, America legalizes cyber war. The U.S. Department of Defense has long advocated going on the offensive against criminal gangs and foreign governments that seek and often succeed to penetrate U.S. government and military internet security, steal information, or sabotage operations. Over the past year, and without much fanfare, the Department of Defense has been making preparations to do just that. So I'm wondering about the timing here, if this may have been at least part of the reason that Regina made her move over to Google.
She appears to have worked on Project ARA, which is a modular cell phone, and we have a few pictures, but the trouble that I see is when it is associated with the company New Knowledge, the firm New Knowledge, who we've studied extensively. And New Knowledge, Jonathan Morgan, they were very big into the Russiagate news dissemination, what we sometimes refer to as the mockingbird media. Literally, right before our eyes, ghost written stories about Russia doing this, the Russians were in everything. They were in cell phones. They were in toothpaste. They were in anytime anything went wrong, the Russians were involved. And it got to be ridiculous. I think it was repeated so often that it eventually lost its potency. But we do see that there's a connection, New Knowledge, NK Labs. It's right on their website as a project partner. And then following the story, we see Motorola included. What ended up happening at Google is I believe they sold off that project. It was just moving too slowly. But the objective was to actually monopolize the cell phone market by bringing the cost down so low that it would be a barrier to entry, and they would literally monopolize the market using that strategy. Now, Google may have realized that could have been interpreted from an antitrust perspective as predatory pricing, and especially if they're monopolizing hardware, software, and the actual usage rate. So that's a pretty good case that would be built there for vertical integration, horizontal integration also at the same time, which is generally that's what Teddy Roosevelt was fighting with the oil companies and the railroad companies and the collusion and all these things that we see today. So another character enters the scene, and we won't get into it too much today, but Paul Aramenko of Ukraine. Paul Aramenko was a driving force behind Project ARA. And the project will come back. I'm hearing that the modular cell phone idea has not gone away. It failed in the initial stages and was shelved and sort of put on the back burner, and to all intents and purposes sort of went away, but it's coming back and probably will become a story as we move forward. And Don, I'm going to just pause here for a second and get and Cindy, your thoughts on the on this crossover of this new world of New Knowledge sort of moving into the picture.
I do have something that I want to add on Regina, and that is her idea of envisioning the future in a more or less neutral way, and the likelihood that she wasn't able to do that, I think, is pretty high. She found herself in some things that she thought would be technically neutral, but that turned out not to be. She found that the idea of being able to give people a window into understanding was probably also that same venue being used by people who wanted to advance their understanding of what people should find to be true. So anybody that's in tech is going to come up against that choice, and how she dealt with it, I think, is interesting. We can't really know what decisions she made, but it's very possible that she would not have sided with those that wanted to manipulate minds. Hopefully, she is more oriented towards an open future and letting people make their own choices, but we don't know for sure.
So we're just going to cycle back to the MBTI for a second and trade some opinions. I previously mentioned the INTJ, ENTJ guess, and just a point to make is they're both very rare in the female of the population, and the effect of that is that sometimes there's sociological implications with that as well. And she does refer to herself as a nerd many times, and it's just that we have so much disparity between the genders in MBTI. It's really striking. The dominant force in the female population is the sensing feeling block, which comprises well over 1/3 of the population. And then in the males, we have the sensing thinking type dominating the top 3, or 36% of the population. So when you have a block of type that concentrated, it can have an effect, a spillover effect on the other people who are kind of coping with fitting in, to the tribe that has this ethos based on functions that might not be your own. So I look at Regina as being kind of an outsider in this political world in some ways. My case for making her, whether introvert or extrovert, is when I look at her speech, it was kind of moving in a way, the last clip that we did, but it does have kind of an almost antiseptic logical edge to it. So that's why I think I'm going to favor the extroverted thinking function as being the dominant, but still falling back on an introverted intuition to have such good contact with archetypal formations. It's just that the thought process controls that perceptual depth that she does have. I mean, it's a very powerful profile, either one, for a female, INTJ, ENTJ, because it stands out, and just because it's functionally kind of an interesting thing for a scientist to have in their toolbox.
Yeah, interesting. I'm tending, because she favors, or at least when I listen to her, what I hear coming out as being the real anchoring of where she's coming from, it does have to do with intuitive archetypes that she's actually implementing through the thinking process. So when I hear her, I hear somebody coming from an intuitive access to a deeper reality. It's not somebody who is thinking on her feet so much as somebody who's drawing from her depths, if that makes sense. If there was any masochism involved, that would fit with her personality, if I am correct about her subtype.
Well, I think she's very hard on herself. I think that's almost evident looking at her face. And when I first watched the video of her when she was wearing the white suit, I thought she was a 1, because she seems like she keeps herself very tightly reined in. And then I saw some other videos of her in which she definitely has a 4 look. She wears jewelry, I think that, and I know this might sound kind of trite, but or trivial, but she wears jewelry that I would be more accustomed to seeing a 4 wear than a 1, and so that was kind of part of what tipped the scales for me. But again, she just looks like somebody who keeps herself very tightly reined in, and very, very disciplined, doesn't really let much emotion show. I think what I've seen of her, I think I've seen her smile once. It was a very tight smile in which the corners of her mouth didn't really turn up so much as they were drawn back. So I think I almost feel sad for her. She does not seem like she would find very much joy in very many activities.
Well, I did hear her cut loose in one of the speeches. It was when she got the award at Caltech, I think it was. So I don't know. The other thing I'm reading between the lines, I think she probably, maybe it was a ROTC scholarship or something, but I believe her family is military. Just from looking at the RedX bios, I believe that's her father who was in the Army, and she was the special advisor to the vice chief of the U.S. Army in 2000. So usually you don't get that close to the top without going through the military and having the communication skills, the military bearing, and all that. So that, I don't know, maybe a nature versus nurture thing too. So hard to tell. But I get the feeling she's got an naturally assertive personality. I don't see her as being, having too much weakness. I think it's like anybody who's gone through basic, in the summer camp or whatever. They're trained to be somewhat impervious in the face of strategic situations.
I just want to read from some of B. Chestnut's book on the 4 self-pres subtype, because it really seems to be right on, and her descriptions are so interesting. The self-preservation 4 is more masochistic than melodramatic, as are the other 4s. For this subtype, masochism is the ego or personality's strategy for getting love. Self-preservation 4s devalue themselves in important ways, which can make it even tougher for them to do all the work that they do to try to get the security and the love that they're longing for. Their attachment to enduring can be seen from the outside as masochistic, but it stems from a desire to earn love and acceptance through being strong and resilient. The motivation for this subtype stems from a desire of the parent for the parent to see the child as not complaining. And these 4s are also masochistically enact a need to prove themselves by working against themselves. They make efforts to get what they need and want, but unconsciously work against themselves at the same time. I think we can take note of the career changes that she's made that seem to be kind of counterproductive, even though she's near the top. She moves on right before something big happens, maybe. Formerly called reckless dauntless, this subtype is more recently referred by the name tenacity. These 4s move toward activities that require large capacity for endurance as a way to earn love. This subtype, and this is what Cindy was talking about, resembles a 1 or a 3. The self-preservation 4s focus on autonomy, self-sufficiency, and working hard may make them look like a 1. However, this 4 feels a wider range of emotion, both ups and downs than 1s, even if they don't always express their feelings. Self-preservation 4s can look like 3s, especially self-pres 3s, in that they work hard to achieve a sense of security and may be anxious. However, in contrast to 3s, these 4s will often work at cross purposes, unintentionally thwarting their own efforts, whereas 3s tend to achieve what they are working for. 4s also feel their emotions more than 3s do. It can look like a type 7, when they're on their upside. And in some ways, it's the opposite of the 4, because the self-pres 4s express a desire, express a need to be liked. So I thought that was all very interesting. And I'm thinking that's probably her. Again, we don't know her personally, but we can only go by the videos. But that sort of fits what we see in the life script that we read about.
Well, it's so the other big transition after the Google stint, and I think things kind of got kicked around with the Project ARA, certainly, and the status of Motorola is really hard to figure out. Somebody would have to really explain that, but the next step for her was the brief stint at Facebook in the Building 8 project, and her title was VP of Engineering, and the stated objective of the Building 8 group was to connect everyone on Earth. A lofty goal, but she tends to like those lofty goals, and as we've touched on, she does thrive on failure in some ways. She openly states that several times in these YouTube videos that are still up all over the internet. However, we haven't heard a peep out of her for a long time. I'd say the Facebook incident, we don't know what happened there either. There are lots of theories, but no conclusions. She made a fairly lengthy statement that you can actually find on Facebook. I don't know if we have that here, but it seems kind of perfunctory, like it was sort of covering up something else that was going on, and we'll never know. And I think there's a certain profundity in the silence that we've experienced. There are no YouTube appearances or anything available on her since then. There's not even any real news as to what projects she might be engaged in. So the Facebook skirmish, as I call it, started with also with Jonathan Morgan when he had the problem with the Moore election, which is another story. We won't go into great detail there, but we did have some real live election or influence rigging going on with the New Knowledge group, and New Knowledge on their website even called for the replacement of the Facebook board. And this came about, I believe, after Regina's departure. The nature of that rift is still not, there's just no information as to why or how. They seem to be sort of moving in the same direction on the censorship issue, but there definitely was a power struggle in what we're calling the deep state or the deeper state, and maybe it was a generational change in the sort of the old guard, new guard moving in. New guard being a little more friendly with stretching the rules, definitely as far as censorship goes, and Jonathan Morgan really leads the charge, both with Russiagate and then later. Now, as we speak, we're dealing with the new program of commercial influencing by basically turning products into social statements, and we're seeing that all around in almost every line. Anybody, you can visit their website and they go into great detail on the faction tracker is what they call it. And it's just sort of it's right there. It's faction tracker. So they're actually tracking people and ostensibly so the commercials can be targeted for certain clusters of people based on what they say in their posts. But there may be a really dark side to that too. So thoughts there?
Yeah, divide and conquer is what Faction Tracker says to me, and it's hard to know whether that's intentional or whether that's just sort of keeping in a business model. But one of the real obvious insights I might have neglected to mention earlier with regard to Regina is the whole for orientation tends to be towards the underdog, and it could very well be that once this new thing got launched, the new thing being major tools in the cyber landscape that could influence and manipulate people. Once she saw the power inherent in that, some of the people that were her associates probably were attracted to that power because they saw that they could have tremendous influence that they thought they could use for good, whereas as a four, Regina's reaction would have been to shy away from that power and the potential abuse of it. So I actually think that's a pretty likely explanation for what's going on with her, is that that she saw some downsides to the increasing power in the tech world and initially thought her influence could be for good, but then when she saw people moving into a newly created power vacuum, she actually shied away from that. I could be wrong, but then that's just a guess on other people of a similar type that I've known. And she did definitely hold a very influential, powerful position in the earlier days of DARPA, but not the super early days, but the recent early days. But once the landscape changed, she saw the abuses and didn't want to be what she would normally characterize as being a part of the bullying that went on under the auspices of that kind of technology.
We've seen whistleblowers come forward recently, and it's easy to imagine people with good intentions going to work for Google and some of the other companies. Google's initial phrase was, don't be evil. So, some of these corporations have probably sold themselves to potential employees. In fact, I'm sure they have. Google has been known as one of the best places to work for fringe benefits and in an atmosphere that's conducive to creativity and things of that nature. So people, I think probably well-meaning people have gone to work there and at some of the other tech companies and discovered that, just as you just said, Don, that it wasn't quite what they thought it was. They found things that were being done that were contrary to their own personal standards of ethics. And, sometimes you can justify something with situation ethics by saying, well, I'm doing it for a good cause. But at a certain point, when if you love people, you care about people, and you realize that it's your next door neighbors and your aunts and your uncles who you're manipulating with your algorithms or whatever it is, whatever technology is being employed, it's probably at some point loses some of the appeal. That the shine goes off the apple. And I think, it's interesting because fours are romantics, and it's kind of a romantic notion. We would like to think of her as having developed a conscience somehow that directed her away from this type of work. But it will be interesting in the years to come to see if she resurfaces somewhere, maybe as a whistleblower. Come on, Regina.
Yeah, I think that there is also a mindset of people being naive about human nature that's involved here. And, you're envisioning a better world. It doesn't necessarily mean that only good people are going to populate this new world that you envision. And some of the abuses that she may have seen, again, we're speculating, would have been disquieting to her, because if you believe in a better future, you tend to want to believe in better people. And this is why we want to ground ourselves in what we really see as being true in human psychology, and both the downsides and the upsides. And here on this show, we're trying to see people the way they really are, see their giftings and their potential for abusiveness, and both in ourselves and in others. And that's why we do what we're doing here, and we hope that this is useful to you.
Yeah, and in conclusion here, the Facebook term that she served was very short. It was from April 2016 through, I believe she announced the departure in October of 2017. And this is about the time the Mueller investigation was starting to heat up. But the departure itself was not abrupt. She stayed on and cleaned up things and actually did finally leave in the early part of 2018. And again, as we've said, not heard from since in any significant way. And in conclusion here, the Google "Don't be evil" has always struck me as odd, and I think it might have struck Regina as odd, because really what that means is don't be evil, but project it outward into somebody else. And
that's a really interesting thought. Thank you for that.
Projection is really a subconscious. It's used a lot in terms, but there's a conscious projection. There's a subconscious, and I think that most thinkers, this is one of the aspects of the thinking-feeling dichotomy, and I believe that Regina would have been completely able to see this too, is that to see both sides. I mean, she said in one of those speeches, one of the clips that we played, she states it right away. She's very aware of the dichotomy in feeling and values, and is found comfort in understanding that, and it seems to be have kind of moved into an abstract dominance over that, the attachment that people fall into over that. And I bet that was probably, I know we've belabored the point of her personality, but I think the reason we did is because it's an underlying theme in the conflict that we're seeing today, and especially in the people that are affecting our ability to transmit information when we have an entity that's actually carrying out a technical warfare against people by affecting their ability to communicate with each other. It's used in war quite a bit, and I believe we're seeing it every day in what we in our cyberspace interactions, Facebook, Twitter, and some of the others, YouTube, and it's got to stop, in our opinion.
just one of the things that you just expressed there, Ken, what Regina's own personal acknowledgement of the split between the feeling and the thinking aspects of her is also the reason why in the Enneagram diagram itself, you don't see a connection between the 4 and the 5. You look at the diagram and you see a split there. Well, that's the reason for that. That's the visual expression that in that diagram of what you just described there and what she describes as something that she's come to peace with. 5s will also understand that personally too. They deal with emotions and the thinking process separately and are at peace with that.
To the curious, the seekers, and the experts, thank you for joining us for this exploration of Regina Dugan and a bit of her role in social media development. We hope that you have enjoyed this time as we have, and we invite you, if you have, to please click like for this video. Look for our videos on BitChute. Follow us on Twitter. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and our BitChute channel. And